understanding of Gorampa, what happens is you contemplate, you use reasonings, and you go through sort of one by one and eliminate each of the four extremes. And then I'm not really sure what happens when you meditate there. But then when you practice that enough, then there's this alternation between the Nyamshak and the Jtop. And in the Nyamshak, you have non-conceptual realization, and then in the Jtop, you're back to conceptuality.
Either you just contemplate the mind itself, like for Sekchuk then, or negation, like for Tsongkhapa. But for Gorampa, it's really
For Gorampa, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's happening there. Yeah.
Or it can be just mind without objects. You just stay there, and later you call it realization. It's another way to go.
Kevin, I'd like to learn more about the doxographical classification of Madhyamaka in Tibet. And I wonder if I could just begin with a few questions. First of all, what do you mean by a doxography?
Categorization of doctrinal schools, who falls into those categories, what the schools hold, positions that they hold, and then where they stack up.
What is it? Sarvamata Sangraha in the 8th century, the Jain doxographer. One of the very first of these doxographers in India. All right, now let's look at the word Siddhanta. Are they always called Drumtas in Tibet, or is there any other word that's used for these things?
For this classification, Drumta, yeah.
The Drumta it is. Okay, good. Well, in India, they were called by many different names. They were sometimes called Darshana texts, as in the Sarvadarshana Sangraha, a very, very important later text, 12th century or so, of Sayana Madhava. And they were sometimes called Sarvamata Sangraha, of however you translate the word mata, doctrine, opinion, something like that. One of the reasons why this is interesting is that Bhavaveka is the first chapter-by-chapter doxographer that we know. It's possible that he was imitating some texts of Dignaga, possibly, but they don't survive, and they were never gathered together into this chapter-by-chapter form. So the chapter-by-chapter summary of different schools seems to come from Bhavaveka, and then it was picked up in the 8th century, especially by Jains, and it then got picked up, and it's very commonly used, of course, as you know, in Indian philosophy. I think probably many of us, George included, would have learned Indian philosophy from a modern doxographical text like this. Now, when was the first Tibetan doxography in this form?
The one I refer to, Yeshe Days, is an 8th century text.
What is it?
An 8th century text.
8th century in Tibet?
Yes.
Okay, and what was its title?
We would translate it a differentiation of view, dawa, darshana.
Okay, so it's a darshana text rather than a drumta text.
I believe the term drumta is in the title, but the short title one uses dawa, darshana.
And what were the chapters? This is another really, really interesting question about these doxographies, because we think of them as having standard chapters, but they're not at all standard. They're all over the place. Different things are included. So I wonder if there is anything like a standard Tibetan structure for what gets included in a doxography.
Right, yeah, and that's what I was trying to allude to, is that what is very standard in Tibetan versions of this is that you'll get the so-called lower three schools, the Vaibhashika, Sautrantaka, and Yogacara.
Yeah.
Those three standard.
So these are Buddhist Siddhanta texts.
Right.
They don't include Hindu.
Over time, they get to include non-Buddhist views as well. The earlier ones interestingly, don't have non-Buddhist views included. And then what I was alluding to is then that the topmost category, Madhyamaka, gets divided up typically in anywhere between 2 and 5 ways.
Okay, so when you say topmost, did they always lead from the most mistaken to the most certain?
Exactly.
So in the 8th century in Tibet that followed this hierarchical structure, okay, that's relatively distinctive historically. That wasn't common in India in that way. Haribhadra didn't do that, and certainly Bhavaveka didn't do that.
And I've never seen a Buddhist use that used anything beyond those 4 basic categories, Vaibhashika, Sautrantaka, Yogacara, Madhyamaka, and in that order.
Okay, and then how is Madhyamaka divided up? That's my last question.
The reference I made here to the earliest is that it's a Sautrantika Madhyamaka versus a Yogacara Madhyamaka.
And that was in the
so-
8th century, really?
So Bhavveka versus.
Okay, I'd love to get the title of this text if I can from you. You don't have to give it to me now. So they only distinguished Sautrantika Madhyamaka from Yogacara Madhyamaka initially?
Right, so that's, and this, some people believe related to a comment that Kamalashila makes about twofold Madhyamaka, although Kamalashila does not specify those.
Okay, so he was the source of the first doxography, Kamalashila, then, it seems. And then when did that was it further elaborated beyond that?
Well, then you get the category really taking off 12th, 13th century Tibet, and just a whole host of subcategories of Madhyamaka, including one that might interest you from your talk yesterday, that where Chandrakirti and Gyanagarbha end up in the same category, based on views of positive views of conventional reality.
So all of this is to ask you actually to explain the answer to your question. When did Bhaviveka become lethal?
I say it comes from Tsongkhapa, that prior to Tsongkhapa's making the primary distinction between Bhaviveka and Chandrakirti, Bhaviveka really was not a pivotal player in Tibetan thinking. And so based on Tsongkhapa's analysis of the distinctions between those two views, and you brought up the expression from Tsongkhapa, however we translate it, Rangitseniki Drupa, as a mark of Bhaviveka's thinking. That expression we do see in 12th century Tibetan literature, but not put in the mouth of Bhaviveka.
When you propose that we think of Mula Madhyamaka Karika as a transformative text, you seem to oppose that to thinking of it as a philosophical text. But transformation requires some kind of method of transformation. That is, that you're not proposing that we think of it, say, as a mantra, so that if we kind of chant the text, that sound will operate directly upon our minds to get rid of views or something like that. So I'm wondering whether you have an alternative to its operating philosophically and discursively as the method of transformation, or whether you think that the method of transformation is through philosophical and discursive thought, in which case we may not be very far apart.
Partly because it was suggested to me by your reference to Ganeri, because Ganeri, in distinguishing between the vehicles and content of these texts, partly he does so with an eye towards attending to the protreptic, as he says, use of the text, but he thinks that's not mutually exclusive of thinking of them as nevertheless having defensible truth claims. And it seems to me that none of the proponents of the, let's call it, rationalist reading of Nagarjuna is committed to thinking, or should be committed to thinking, that that's all that happens in the texts. Thinking that that's the best way to characterize his arguments isn't mutually exclusive of thinking that his point isn't just that we have to assent to the conclusions of these arguments and then that's it. I mean, that you can characterize his arguments as eminently rational, but still think that you have to do something more than just be persuaded by the arguments. And so there's still scope for talk about their transformative effect.
Yeah, as I was reading this and thinking about what was discussed earlier today, I was realizing that I don't think I agree with myself anymore. I
think you would.
maybe thinking about this idea of transformation, I think there are different ways that texts can be transformative. So, I mean, that's the point of a philosophical argument is to persuade your opponent, to transform your opponent's opinion. But I mean, a mantra can be transformative also, but just in a different sort of way. So, yeah, now I don't really know, but I think I was trying to draw too sharp of a distinction between the philosophical view and then this idea of a text being transformative. And I think now, the more that we're all talking about it, the more that we're all thinking about it. It's just, you can still read this text as philosophy, or you can read it as, I think what I was trying to do in this paper was say that Nagarjuna is describing this transformative process.
I'd like to know what is reason. I'd like to know what is reason. That's my first question. My second question is, I asked this to Tom Tillemans at the IABS conference. People have been drawing similarities between Madhyamaka Buddhism and Hume, sometimes drawing similarities to Quine, right, as you probably learned in undergrad, et cetera, right? So is Quine a prasangika? I mean, as long as we just learn the same thing from Quine, are we all good then? Or if we just develop an anti-foundationalist position and develop a set of arguments in support of that anti-foundationalism, have we done everything that Chandrakirti wants us to have done? Are we thereby awakened? So what is reason? Can we get awakening without all that fuzzy stuff? Like, can we reach the goal without all that fuzzy stuff like nirvikalpa jnana, buddhatva? We don't need that maybe, right? So what is reason? Can we get it without all that fuzzy stuff?
What reason is either, but the important distinction we have to draw, and I think which would answer your point to an extent, is the distinction between understanding a point and assenting to a point and realizing a point. And the way I try to spell this out elsewhere was saying, by look, I mean, if you look at an example from mathematics and look at, say, study of high-dimensional geometry, then you can do it all by axioms without developing any sort of idea of what a four-dimensional cube would look like, or you can try to develop your spatial intuition and actually think about this not just as an entity that conforms to certain rules, but you actually get an idea of what a high-dimensional space would look like, and you, say, extrapolate from three-dimensional to a four-dimensional space. Now, I would think these are very different ways of thinking about mathematical objects, right? And I think there's a very sense in, say, mathematical methodology that you need the latter approach in order to do real creative work on the topic, right? It's not just that you know what the axioms say and you can handle, you actually have to get a sort of mental picture in a very general way of what's going on there. So I think this understanding might lead us some way to seeing that there is more just to signing off the axioms, right? Or in the philosophical case, there is more than just to checking the boxes and saying, okay, we agree with all of that. That is just the understanding part, and that is just the first bit, right? So I think it's important to realize that what is interesting about the Madhyamaka text is that they are not just philosophical texts to the extent that they try to convince us of some position, but they're trying to do something more. They also induce us to generate a realization of that position. Now, what exactly that entails, I think you probably have to ask a meditator, right, rather than a philosopher. But that there is something more to that, I think there is no doubt about that.
In this view of Nagarjuna as the anti-foundationalist, anti-realist, how does this conceptualization of a particular position help to get to what I take you would agree is still the ultimate realization, which is the total absence of any conceptualization, right? And that to me is not, I'm not sure I understand how the transition works.
I don't know that anybody in the Buddhist tradition has a description of precisely the mechanics of the transformation that takes place. I mean, notwithstanding all the path literature, I don't think, I think the tradition most often resorts to ineffability at that point. It's nachintya buddha gochara.
First of all, there is a lot of Marga literature, and a lot of it's in Yogacara, and I recommend that to all Madhyamikans. They should read some Yogacara, which would explain what Nagarjuna is doing. But I have a question to come back to Connie's paper, and actually sort of split off the question also to Jay. I like that paper very much. I agree with a lot of it. The part that I maybe didn't disagree with, that I didn't agree with, is the idea that the climax comes before chapter 25. I think the climax of the text comes chapter 25, verse 9. And I would like Jay to explain to us, and let me say that it's also philosophical. You tried to characterize it as something non-philosophical. I think there's nothing more philosophical for a Madhyamikan than to challenge the very idea of nirvana. We might, because we're having these limits about our commitments to Buddhism in a certain sense, that might be something abstract to think about. If you're a real committed Buddhist, that's not something abstract. You're fully committed to pursuing nirvana, or you're not going to give up sex and cut your hair and eat strange food. I mean, you're very committed to that. So to challenge the very idea of nirvana, which is what he does there, and Chandrakirti sort of brings that out, that nirvana itself, the way it's conceptualized by Buddhists, is nonsense. That's very, very challenging and very philosophical. But verse 9, how is that logical?
I don't see that as the climax even of that chapter. I think the no difference verse is the climax of that chapter, as Connie said. But I guess I want to come back, let me circle around that and come back to George and Dan for a minute. I guess I think that something slightly misleading about George's question and something slightly pessimistic about Dan's answer. The misleading part about George's question is George said, well, doesn't everybody agree that the ultimate is non-conceptual thought? And I'd say no. The ultimate is emptiness, and that's to be, and a non-conceptual thought is a means of apprehending that. It's a pramana, it's not the thing, right? So, and I think that that's important, and that's there not just in Buddhist philosophy, but that's there in Western philosophy, right? I mean, if we think about the end of the Tractatus, when Wittgenstein says, if anybody who understands what I've said recognizes it as nonsense and has to transcend the propositions to see the world aright, it's that contrast between thinking and seeing that's really essential. And a lot of what's being, you're looking at me funny, George, I'm not sure why. That's actually what that's actually what the text says. I'm sorry. So even there, Wittgenstein is drawing a distinction between a kind of discursive thought and what we might call a non-conceptual, a non-discursive apprehension of the nature of reality. But of course, when you ask him, well, how do you do it? What's it like? He tells you, well, I'm not going to say anything. You've got to pass over it in silence. And then we're reminded of Frank Ramsey's wonderful remark about that, right? What one can't say, and one can't whistle it either. And I thought that you were kind of inviting Dan to whistle. And Dan should have resisted the demand to whistle, but nonetheless pointed out that there really is a kind of cognitive distinction, as Jan pointed out, between being able to reason about something and being able to say a bunch of true stuff about it, and actually being able to see it as it is, or to see it as true. And I really do think that for Nagarjuna, like for all Madhyamakas, the goal is a kind of a way of seeing, a darshana. And that, I think, is really important. So to come to the Nirvana chapter, I mean, it says, I'm going to the unconditioned stuff we can talk about.
Text here?
Excuse me, no. But Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa, in commenting on that, go into a long thing about nirvana being dependent upon conditions to attain, but once you've attained it, it's not then dependent upon conditions, and you get the nice metaphor of the lamp goes out, you don't have to ask, why is it still out, why is it still out, why is it still out? Once it's out, you don't have to talk about continuous conditions for it, all that stuff. I don't think that stuff is philosophically terribly difficult, but the interesting climax in that chapter is the non-difference chapter, and the non-difference verse. And that really does come back to ideas that I think we see Wittgenstein going after in the Tractatus, that nirvana, in this sense, is a cessation, right? Of course it's a cessation, but it's not a cessation of the world. It's a cessation of a particular way of engaging with the world. And that's why when Nagarjuna says there's no difference between nirvana and samsara, it's not that somehow the world goes away or you stop engaging with it. It's a same world, different engagement. And
I agree with that,
and it's
because I
an
don't think
engagement without without the superimposition of conceptual fabrication.
Yeah, I don't find the non-difference verse very difficult. I think that's easy to understand. It's verse 9 that gives me trouble.